Alright guys, this is the online lecture notes for 2013 Connerland APUSH covering Chapter 9. In this chapter we'll be covering a couple of things with the main focus on the Articles of Confederation and the writing of the Constitution. First thing we want to look at is some of the inspirations that the Founding Fathers used to put together the documents that will come to govern these new United States of America. Obviously they looked to the past, they looked at documents, they looked at systems of governments and things like that. The first thing I want to focus on is Greek civilization, and what we borrowed from them was their system of democracy. Now, in Greece back in the day, not everyone was considered a citizen and not everyone had the right to vote, so everyone couldn't participate, but they kind of used that as a basic foundation for the system of government we would have. The next place is Roman civilization, and the main thing they borrowed was their system of checks and balances, which ensured that no one branch of government had more power than another one. Next thing we're going to look at is the Magna Carta. Now, Magna Carta is a document that was signed by King John of England in 1215, and the main thing that it did for our purposes is it placed monarchs and magistrates under the rule of law. In other words, it said that no official of the government is above the law. They have to hold to the same types of laws and rules of order that are followed by everyone else in the country. The next two inspirations for the founding documents were two thinkers from the Enlightenment period in Europe during the 1600s and 1700s. The first one we're going to look at is Thomas Hobbes, who wrote something called Leviathan in 1651. Now, in Leviathan, Hobbes proposes something called the social contract theory, in which he says, in a society, people give up certain rights of natural law, such as the right to own property or whatever it is, in return for protection that is provided by a government. Now, the key point for our purposes is that nowhere in it does he say that the government was required to protect the law. He just kind of states it as a fact without having any backup. Next is John Locke, who wrote two treatises of government in 1689, where he expanded a little bit on Hobbes' work by saying that, once again, people possess certain natural rights, such as life, liberty, etc. But he took it a little bit further than Hobbes by saying that the government had a responsibility to protect the people in the society, and if they didn't, and this is a key point, if they didn't, the people had a right to replace the government if they failed. So those were some of the inspirations for the documents that we're going to be looking at in this chapter. Now we're going to start looking at the progression or the steps towards the writing of the federal constitution that we have in our country today. First thing we're going to look at on the road to the Constitution are the basic state constitutions that existed after the Revolutionary War. Now, a key point to remember as we go through these, looking at both this and the Articles of Confederation, is the fact that one of the major fears that people had coming out of the Revolutionary War was that the new government we set up would have too much power. In other words, their biggest fear was the reestablishment of a monarchy. They didn't want to deal with a king. They didn't want to deal with anything like that. So they gave as much power locally and as much power away from a central authority as they possibly could. When looking at these constitutions, a couple of the rows, the state governor had a very limited power under these state constitutions, to the point where some states had even abolished the office of governor. Now, this power had to go somewhere, and where it went were the legislatures, who had an incredible amount of power during this time. They were able to do things like declare war, foreign policy. In other words, they took care of the big issues in each individual state. So now we move forward to the first document that is an attempt to govern the entire United States of America, and it's the Articles of Confederation. As a brief overview of it, the thing is passed in 1777, but not ratified to 1781, so you can see it was a little bit of a process to get this thing through. A couple of the key characteristics: there's no president in this, there's no king, there's no central authority or court system involved in this document. Also, another key point that comes into play with it: every state remains sovereign. In other words, they do not answer to anybody. They run their own things, all right? Because of that, the national government, when it's set up, can't make the states do anything. And we'll look at that in a couple of minutes as one of the major weaknesses of this document. Moving on to some of the provisions or major components of the Articles of Confederation. Now, the key point to remember is that at the end of the day, it's going to give state power over federal power, okay? So states above federal government. When they were confronted with an issue or when they had to vote on something, each state equaled one vote in Congress, and that was done to ensure that larger states would not dominate smaller states when it came to number of votes, power, etc. Also, the federal government does not have the power to tax, so that means they have to rely on the state governments to basically keep the government running, to keep funding the things that they need to do. Now, to their end, the national government did have some powers under the Articles of Confederation. First of all, they could declare wars and also conduct foreign affairs. They could also standardize currency and arbitrate disputes between states. So when it came to big issues that impacted everyone, the government did have some power, but for the most part, the everyday running of things were left to each individual state. Now, although we're going to focus on the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, at the end of the day, it did accomplish two very important things. Number one, it set up the Land Ordinance of 1785, and number two, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Both of these dealt with the Northwest Territory that you can see right here, and encompasses the modern-day states of Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. Now, the Land Ordinance of 1785 was basically a quick way to survey and settle the lands that were located in the Northwest Territory. What they did is came around and surveyed and made 6 square mile blocks. Once they did that, they further divided it into 1 square mile blocks. They then sold this land at the price of $1 an acre, and they were sure to leave 1 square block in every one for the funding of education. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 went a little bit further, and it actually established 3 to 5 states from the Northwest Territory, and a key characteristic that will be important going forward is that it prohibited slavery in these territories. Moving on to the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, and these things are pretty important because at the end of the day, it's what made it a basically ineffective document. In other words, it wasn't feasible to run a country of our size at the beginning of our existence. Now, under it, there were certain things that Congress could not do, and I've already talked about a couple, but just to reiterate, they couldn't force states to pay taxes, okay? So they relied on them to fund the government basically on a voluntary basis. They also could not raise an army without state support, so there was no central military force in case of attack, invasion, or whatever you want to call it. Also, they were not able to regulate trade, particularly in between states, so it made interstate commerce basically impossible because each state had its own form of currency or could enact its own form of currency. Also, there was no executive branch or court system under this document either. Now, the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation really start to manifest themselves with something called Shays' Rebellion. Now, as a little background on it, there's a lot of problems going on with state and the federal government at this point. One, they've got bad credit. All right, they haven't been able to pay back their loans on the things that they borrowed to fund the revolution. Two, they've got accumulating interest on these loans, which is basically making it impossible to pay back. Three, states are not paying their share of taxes because remember, there's no enforcement mechanism. In other words, they're having to do it on a voluntary basis when they want to or when they can. Bottom line on it, the federal government and everybody else at this time is broke. So in response to these problems, states come up with a couple of solutions. One is to print more money and two is to raise property taxes. Now, printing more money, a basic economic principle says when you print more money, it drops the value of it because as you have more of it flooded into the system, inflation kicks in. So in other words, people are not able to buy as much with the money that they have. And property taxes are going to hurt the middle income or the middle class of these different states. In response to these things that state governments are doing, a guy named Daniel Shays begins to protest in Massachusetts. And he wants things like lower taxes and the issuance of paper money, particularly because taxes are having to be paid in gold and silver at this time, which is a little bit harder to come by. He, along with other farmers, begin to call for revisions to state constitutions, and eventually he begins a rebellion by leading a march on a federal arsenal. Now, in response to that, the governor of Massachusetts at this time sends the state militia to stop the rebellion, and when he does this, it ends up in bloodshed, with 4 farmers being killed and many more being injured. So, as far as the results of it and what's really important about Shays' Rebellion, it really showed that the Articles of Confederation was not going to work in instances like this. The reason being that the governor had to send the state militia in rather than a national army because Congress didn't have the authority to put an end to anything that was going on in relation to rebellions, protests, or anything like that. So what ends up happening is people, and when I say people, I mean the top levels of society, begin to fear what's called a mobocracy, in other words, mob rule. And also they feel that it's time to revise the Articles and come up with a way of the central government being stronger. So we move forward to revising the Articles of Confederation and making it a more effective system of government. And basically what we end up with is transforming it into the Constitution that we have today. So, in an attempt to revise these things, the Philadelphia Convention is called in 1787, and the basic purpose of it, again, is just simply to revise the Articles of Confederation, not to come up with a completely new document. All states in this were represented except Rhode Island at the time. There were a total of 55 delegates. Now, there were a couple of big names that were missing during this thing. One was Thomas Jefferson, who was actually in France at this time and unable to get back in time to participate, and two was Patrick Henry, who had some serious problems with any revisions to it. He liked the Articles of Confederation the way they were because it took took the power out of the hands of a centralized government and left it with the states. So as we move forward in the Philadelphia Convention, there are some points of agreement amongst the delegates who are there. Number one, as they looked at it, they realized that simply revising the Articles of Confederation was not going to work. We needed a completely new document. Two, they believed that document needed to be written down so it could be interpreted by future generations. Three, they believed we needed a republican form of government in which the people were represented. Four, a limited government power, particularly a balance between states and central or national authority. And five, separation of powers to ensure that one branch of the government or one section of the government does not have more power than another. So while they're there, it's not all points of agreement. They're not really getting along on everything. There's two main issues that come up for debate during this convention. And number one is, what powers will the government have? In other words, how much power are the states going to have to give up to make this national government work? And number two, which we'll look at in a second, how is the state's representation going to be determined? Is it going to be by the number of people who live in the state? Is it going to be by the number of taxpayers in the state? Or is it going to be something else? And that's what we'll focus on here in a second. So when it comes to the number of representatives that each state will have, it basically boils down to two different plans. One is proposed by big states, one by small states. All right, and the one from the big state side is the Virginia plan, in which they propose, number one, a bicameral legislation. In other words, there'll be two houses. Number two, they say the upper house will be selected by the lower house. And number three, for our purposes, the most important one, the representatives, or the number of representatives, will be based on the population of the state. As a counter to that, New Jersey comes up with their own plan where they say that's all well and good that you want to do that, but if we base the number of representatives on the population, smaller states like us, New Jersey, or Maryland, or Delaware, or Rhode Island, or Connecticut, are not going to have near as much power as states like New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and all this. So what they propose is that, look, regardless of how big or how much population the state has, everyone should have an equal number of representatives in Congress. So what ends up happening out of this is one of the first compromises we'll talk about this year, and it's referred to as the Great Compromise. And what they did was they took elements of both plans and put them together. They agreed that there would be a bicameral legislature. In other words, you have two houses. In the case of us, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The lower house, which is the House of Representatives, the number of representatives will be based on the population of the state. The members of the upper house, or the amount of representatives in it, which is the Senate, would be set at a fixed number, which, as you know, is now 2. Another sticking point that came about when they were trying to figure out how many representatives each state would have was, how were they going to count slaves? And there were two different point of views on this. The North wanted to count slaves for taxation purposes, but not for representatives in Congress. The South, on the other hand, wanted to count them for representation, not taxation. Now, the reason the South wanted to use them for representation is pretty obvious. All right, if you're able to count this incredible number of people who are located in the states, when it came to a voting block or when it came to issues they cared about, the South would have way more power than the North and would be able to carry a vote at the end of the day. So what they ended up with was the second compromise, or the 3/5 compromise, in which a slave, for representation and tax purposes, would count as 3/5 of a man. So, now that we've looked at kind of how this thing came together and some of the compromises that made the Constitution, let's move on to some of the major components of it, or some of the major features. The first thing for our purposes is the separation of powers, which basically deals with, like we've talked about, the fact that one branch of the government or one section cannot have more power than another one. And the way it divides up is as follows. The legislative branch, their responsibility is to make laws. The executive branch is in charge of enforcing the law that the legislative branch sets up. And then, at the end, the judicial branch is in charge of interpreting the laws that come in. We now move on to the division of powers between the national and state government, and they have pretty well-defined roles when it comes down to it on what they're allowed to do. The national government has what are called delegated powers, and this includes things like declaring war, or creating an army and navy, or setting up things that are on a national basis like a postal system. The state has what are called reserved powers, where they're in charge of things like education, marriage, speed limits, things that are determined on a state-by-state basis. And lastly, we have what are called concurrent powers, which are powers that are shared by both the national and state government. These are things like taxation. A lot of states have state taxes and federal taxes. Things like eminent domain, which deal with property laws and things like that. So there's a definite division and sharing of powers when it comes between these two. The next thing we're going to look at is implied powers, and these are things that are not explicitly written in the Constitution. The federal government can, however, exercise these by assuming the powers when it's necessary and proper, which you see from the clause right there. It's also known as the elastic clause, which is why you have this right here to help you remember it. Some examples of this are things like regulating airlines or radio and television standards and things like that were never envisioned by the Founding Fathers but have come up as national issues or problems at one point or another. Lastly on our list of features are the checks and balances given to our government by the Constitution. Now, it deals with how they can basically counter each other to ensure that one branch of the government doesn't get more power than another. You can read the things on here just as well as I can, but just to briefly go over them, the executive branch, in order to check the other branches, can veto bills and appoint judges who maybe fall more in line with their political philosophies and what they want to try to do. The judicial branch can declare acts of Congress unconstitutional, and we'll look at plenty of those as we go throughout the year. And then the legislative can override a veto from the executive branch of the president, and they also must approve appointments that the president makes when it comes to the judiciary, cabinet post, and things like that. So it's a way to kind of ensure there's a leveling off of powers in the federal government. So bottom line, the accomplishments of the Constitution are as followed, and they've all been covered for the most part. It set up checks and balances to ensure an equal balance of power. It set up a powerful executive, but one that could be checked by the other branches of government. It also set up a national judiciary, or the Supreme Court that we have today. It also approved the selection methods of the legislature and the representation that each could have, and it allowed for expansion with the addition of amendments and things that make it what's called a fluid document as it goes throughout its history. So now that we have an actual written document, now it's got to be passed by the states. And in these next couple of slides here, we're going to deal with some of the problems that they had getting this document ratified to make it the overriding document of the government and of the land. So basically how this thing is going to get passed is each state is going to call a special convention in which they're going to vote on whether to approve or turn down the Constitution that had been written. To make it a little bit easier for passage, because there was some debate about how this thing was going to work, the framers only intended, or they only said, that 9 of the 13 states needed to vote yes on this thing for it to be ratified or approved and become the law of the land. While this is going on, there are two very distinct camps of people who are either for the Constitution or want to amend it already or change some things in it. The ones who are for it are known as the Federalists, all right, and they're the ones that support the Constitution. As far as the characteristics of these guys, number one, they wanted a strong central government. They were very in favor of it. As far as what group made up this people, it was normally respectable, educated people who were at the higher levels of society, and they were normally very conservative. On the other side of the fence, we have the anti-federalists who are against ratification. As far as what they wanted, they felt that this Constitution, this federal document that gave all this power to a federal government, would completely destroy states' rights over time. They believed that a central government was a threat to liberty, and what they were really worried about is slipping back into a form of monarchy that we dealt with while we were under the British Crown, and they were worried that the same problems that we confronted before the Revolution and the reason we rebelled would repeat itself over time if the central government was given too much power. Alright guys, that wraps up the Chapter 9 lecture. Chapter 10 is on the way. This covers the basics of it, and anything else we will cover in class.